all of the 4 presentations that we have provided you. I'd like to welcome our presenters. We have 3 presenters today, or actually 4 presenters today. We'll begin with Dylan Brown. He's our Natural Resources Program Manager for the Air Force in the Pacific. We have Benjamin Silvernail. He's a social scientist for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Institute for Water Resources. And then we have Shannon Boguser. Shannon is a GIS project manager with Colorado State University, the Center for Ecological Management of Military Lands. And Gwen Ellis is the GIS program analyst for CIML as well. Welcome all of you. So I'm going to share my screen now and throw up some slides. And we'll begin with Dylan Paul Brown. Dylan, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
All right. Well, I did a screen capture of your, you did 2 presentations for us. One entitled A Century of Land Use Change at Wake Atoll, and followed by another presentation, A Century of Wake Fish Surveys, also at Wake Atoll. Appreciate both of those presentations. I went through them both, and you know, I'd like to, if anyone on the here in the room would like to ask questions of any of these 2 presentations, feel free to raise your hand or just come online, unmute your mic and ask questions, or we can use the chat we'll use the chat to answer any questions as well. So Dylan, one question I had for you is, what's the population out at Wake Atoll, and was there any effects from the pandemic associated with Wake Island?
Other than it's harder to get out there right now because you have to get pre-screened for COVID, there's really no issues getting out to the island. It was essentially locked down and hasn't really had any issues with COVID. There are roughly 40 people out on the island right now. It's usually historically been about 100 or 130, but that has varied everything from in the 1970s, there was upwards of 8,000 people on the island, and turn of the century, there was none. So usually there's about 100 though.
Okay, great. Can you just briefly talk a little bit about your first presentation, A Century of Land Use Change? I know you did a lot of historical research to bring us this presentation. Can you just briefly talk to it, just to refresh some of the folks here listening?
Sure. So the idea with that project was looking at all of the historic maps and records we had of the island and trying to archive those, and that kind of became a function of looking at land use and how it has changed over time. There's an idea called shifting baselines, and it's this idea that when you look at an area, you assume that it's always been that same way. And through the use of some of the historic information that we could get our hands on, it's pretty evident that Wake has ebbed and flowed in how it's used and the land cover that we see out there. So everything from almost 0% forest cover to 80% forest cover and up and down thereafter. So for the last century, things have not been very stable out there. Underwater, everything's pretty stable, but on land, things have developed and changed, and the island is actually extremely resilient and bounces back from perturbations pretty quickly.
Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen again, and we'll flip over, Dylan, to your second presentation, which is a century of wake fish surveys. Can you briefly talk to this study that you performed?
Sure. So this actually was just recently published or accepted for publication in Pacific Science, and looking at all of the data from every researcher that's ever gone out to do fish surveys out at wake over the past century and slightly before, essentially increasing the knowledge and understanding that we have of the fish that live around the island. A couple of the interesting things that came out of this are we have a more connectivity with Hawaii than we would have thought. There's several fish species that have been identified at wake that were historically thought to be endemics only found on Hawaii, but they're actually found on wake as well. And this fish surveys here have really broadened our perspective in deep water surveys. Wake is extremely vertical. It's a very steep mountain underwater. And so there's very little coral reef habitat. But that doesn't mean that there's not a diversity of things out there. And so the most recent deep water surveys and the addition of some pelagic surveys have broadened our understanding of what's out there. So even 20 years ago, we thought there was 300 fish out there. We now know that there's over 400 different species out on the island. So using a bunch of GIS to understand fish habitats and where we could target fishery surveys to look for new things, and then understanding the amount of available habitat by using some 3D work within GIS to identify and understand the locations and the amount of available habitat allowed us to do some predictions of what we thought should be there, and then be able to do some ground truthing to look at actual in-water surveys to find out if we were right and add some things to the list.
Okay, thank you. And the question I had is, Wake Island is very isolated, of course, in the Pacific Ocean, but is there any commercial fishing pressure nearby that has an effect on Wake Atoll?
Technically, no. Officially, we're protected within the EEZ, so the exclusive economic zone, 200 miles out from Wake, but that's not really enforced. And we do see, especially with sharks, we've been seeing some fishing, what appears to be fishing pressure with dead sharks washing up on shore from definite anthropogenic effects. So it's entirely plausible that we have people transiting through the area that are fishing, but definitely not in a large commercial capacity. So the populations are pretty protected by default from being a marine or a Air Force base.
Oh, okay. And a follow-up question to you. I noticed you had another presentation that was in the climate change track with regard to the sea level change due to climatical effects. How do you see that over time gradually changing the local fish population on the atoll?
I think realistically, sea level rise is probably not going to affect the populations or the distribution of populations of fish on the island. Most everything that's there occurs within habitats that are not going to necessarily be affected by sea level change. There are a few types of fish which we believe use the lagoon as a nursery habitat. And if that lagoon area in the center of Wake disappears, that could potentially cause some impacts on a few species, notably bumphead parrotfish and humphead wrasse. But the vast majority of fish would not be affected.
Okay, thank you. And so we'll move on now to our next speaker, Mr. Ben Silvernail. 1 second for the slide to adjust. There we go. Ben, are you still on?
Okay, I just unmuted. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Great.
All right.
You could join us.
Yeah.
So can you give us?
I just wanted.
Yeah, go ahead and give a quick brief of your presentation to refresh minds. Thank you.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say thanks for having me as a presenter during this session. So I was actually lucky enough to present at the 2020 workshop before the lockdown started about how the Army Corps of Engineers is endeavoring to process and share information about the relationship between large-scale conservation priorities and the national distribution of the Corps' water resource development projects, and in particular how the Corps can contribute to habitat enhancement that's based on large-scale conservation and the location of these projects within a landscape matrix. So this year's presentation actually covers a similar subject, but we're looking at how the Corps is studying external factors that can impact the environmental stewardship mission at these water resource development projects. And, specifically, how can we classify and designate what we could say are like projects? And then from there, plan resourcing needs and assess the risk to authorized purposes and ecosystems from the effects of human development and the establishment and spread of invasive species, particularly in areas immediately surrounding these projects. So the work we're doing, we're definitely in the early phases of this. We're, assessing what constitutes suitable data and organizing our metrics to align with specific questions that we're trying to answer. It was touched on in the presentation that we're relying on data that's reported through existing data call systems that the Corps Civil Works program utilizes, but we're also exploring other external spatial data that may be useful so long as we can get stakeholder buy-in. Yeah, I don't think that this was covered too much in the presentation, and we are, like I said, very much in the early phases of our analysis and assessment, but we're taking this data to do some initial principal components analysis and looking at some cluster analysis to see if we can identify early on if there's any combinations of metrics that may lead to higher rates of new encroachment or failed outcomes from invasive species establishing. So it's a bit early for us to draw any conclusions really on either of these fronts, but we're finding that we're working with some pretty noisy data given the national coverage and the
not everything, but it's 2 hours behind.
In the metrics that we're using. So these are things that need to be accounted for. So with that, I'm happy to be part of the panel. Sorry, go ahead.
Ben, may I interrupt you really quickly? This is Mike. Hi. Folks, if you're on a phone or if you're on your video using your computer, it looks like a phone number is calling in. You're unmuted and we can hear everything that's being said. So please mute yourselves. Paul, sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. That was pretty much all I had for just a brief overview to kind of remind people what was in the presentation, but I'm happy to learn more about what other presenters are doing here and to answer any questions that folks on the line may have, and I'm looking forward to the next time this group can get together in person. So, thanks.
Thank you, Ben. And I will say, after viewing your presentation, it did jog my memory of many years ago when I did work for the Corps as a park ranger. During a flood event, we had to go around the lake and make assessments for properties that were probably likely to be encroaching on the lake project. And turns out we did find quite a few houses that were affected by flood events because they got away with building within the floodplain or flood elevation of the lake project. And that helped me recognize many years ago the continual problem with what we call monument migration, where the survey monuments tend to move or being moved by adjacent owners so that they can capitalize on the view of the lake when they build their homes, not realizing they are probably going to pay for that later. And a lot of them do pay for it. Any comment?
That's exactly one of the biggest issues that we're looking at there, and resolving those is no easy task. It is definitely a team effort too with the Civil Works program, in that there's a lot of different stakeholders just involved in the process. So I particularly work with a national team that supports natural resource management, and part of that is environmental stewardship, and that's where we fund a lot of the work to do boundary inspections and maintenance. But obviously there's a huge component of this that involves, a separate real estate program, and then also the GIS and survey communities of practice, specifically when it comes to having, that boundary data, the boundary marker data, the integrity there. So it's coordination between a couple different programs that is just something that we're building upon. And there's kind of different data systems associated with each of those. And so we're trying to reconcile that. But it's a, much needed work, and it's a very interesting problem to look into. And there's a lot of really smart people that have been looking at this for a while. And this is just kind of continuing on, that need that was identified especially when those, places that are built in the floodplain, or where there should be the ability to store water. That is one of the driving factors behind this. So with that, it's definitely pretty cool. There's just so many parts of it that need to be addressed.
Hey, Paul, Ben, we had a question come in on the chat. It says, a few years ago, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Real Estate was attempting to create fee boundary layers for all lake projects. Did they ever complete the boundaries? Yeah, so there's more boundary data available now than there has been in the past. The Civil Works land data migration effort, where specific parcels are mapped out, I believe that's been either coming to a close or is done. They've got the parcels mapped, and now it's a matter of building out that external boundary that you could count as the fee boundary, because a lot of these projects, they're really comprised of many parcels that were acquired at different times, and it's kind of something that has to be maintained constantly, the database of these different sections of land that ultimately comprise the project. So we've got pretty good national coverage of the fee boundary for all lakes. I can tell you that in my specific data set that I'm working with for some of our testing, there's still a couple gaps there, but it's not like it was a few years ago.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, I don't see any raised hands or any additions in the chat. I'm gonna go back to the slide share again. In our final presentation, is the CIML group, Shannon Bogesser and Gwen Ellis. And they have a short recording on their slide, so bear with me. Let's see if we can hear this.
Bogesser with the Center for Environmental Management of Military Lands, who is proud to be a sponsor of NMFWA this year. I'd like to welcome you to the Geographic Information Systems technical session today. It looks like there are several great talks in this session. One of the presentations you will hear in today's session will be provided by Gwen Ellis from CIML. CIML has a robust GIS program that provides environmental support to a variety of agencies. Please feel free to contact myself, Gwen, or stop by CIML's virtual booth if you have any questions. I would like to thank the presenters today and hope you all enjoy the presentations they have put together for us.
Okay, did we hear that okay?
I think
Michael,
so.
were you able to hear that?
Yes, I was able to hear that. It was a little, the sound was a little muted, but it could be heard.
Okay, okay, great. And so with us today, we have Gwen Ellis. And
Hello.
Gwen, welcome.
Thank you.
Looks like a lot of hard work went into this for the Air Force. I forget the count of how many Air Force bases this data covers, but it's overwhelming to me how much data is involved in pulling all this together. It's just amazing work.
Thank you. Yeah, we cover 102 sites for the Air Force.
Okay, great. And so is there any initiative on this front with the Department of the Army? That's my first question. Have y'all done any work for the Army on this?
This project is just Air Force centered. The Army definitely has its own GIS, work and data management, but we're strictly Air Force focused on this project.
Okay. Can you briefly talk about some of the data? Oh, go ahead, Michael. I'm sorry.
So there's a question in the chat for the Cloud GIS presentation. Is it possible to access the underlying data in some of the Air Force GIMS applications? For example, the vegetation mapping layers? If so, where can you access these underlying data? Most people are seeing the documents in the information presented in documents, the spatial data presented in documents.
Of course, yeah. So when we've run surveys like the floodplain analysis surveys, the vegetation mapping surveys, and climate change assessments, things of that nature, we have been posting the PDF reports that come out as a result, but then the data is also hosted on AFGIMS and other locations. So the floodplain layers are all loaded into their individual story maps, for example, under the floodplain page on the dashboard. But then the vegetation layers, the floodplain layers, those are also hosted in the centralized project geodatabase. So when you go to make a web map, for example, if you were to open a new web map, you could import, you could add the layers. So it's under the AFGIMS environmental map services, and those vegetation and floodplain layers are in there alongside all of the other environmental data layers that we manage. So they're all accessible. I think a lot of them are turned off for data download, but you can make maps and apps and products with it. Once the Air Force finishes kind of setting up the data library and everything like that, they've got it to include data from the GIOs. The environmental data might be available there for download. And then the presentation mentions that we have analysts located at each installation support section to keep the data updated for each installation. So they're available to handle any data deliveries also, or we can handle that at the AFCEC level as well. So there's a lot of different ways to get the data, and there's a lot of different ways we make the data available. So it is more than just those PDF reports that are made available. And I think there's a support button on the dashboard that sends emails to the TSC or myself, Shannon. We can all be contacted for any sort of data request.
Hey, Gwen, one question I have for you is it's with regard to future planning on Air Force bases. Is the master planner for each of the bases engaged in what you're putting together here as far as what symbol pulls together? Is there a master plan embedded into this so that folks can see future development?
So it's on the AFGEM system, so the GeoPortal and the viewer, and that hosts all of the airfield planning, utilities data as well alongside the environmental data. So those planning data sets are there and available to integrate into any products or view on the viewer as well. We also are working with AFCEC planning, and we've coordinated with them as well as AFCEC, CZCA environmental. And that's how we're setting things like floodplain mapping priorities and working with them to make sure that planning's needs are met as well for the data that we're maintaining and making available. And then we also work with NEPA to make sure that they have the data available to them. We host some applications for them for when they're making decisions for basing bed down actions. We're working with them on some tools for 813 analysis and evaluations. And so we are working at multiple levels with planning. The analysts are also making maps and applications at their ISSs and installations, working with their GIOs at the installations, their local planning offices, and then of course the environmental offices that they're directly working with that are driving the data maintenance and updates.
Okay, thank you. Let me just do a quick review here of the chat box and see if we have any other questions. And I don't see anything. So Gwen, were there any questions that you were expecting to be asked? That, you pose yourself and just go ahead and put it out there as an answer, just so folks get a better understanding of your diligent work in GIS?
Sure. So the AFGEM system is hosted by Air Force GeoBase. And so it does require a CAC or Air Force Common Access Card to access that system. And so it's just one of a number of portals. ESRI has their own portals, CSU has its own portal. So this one's Air Force specific. And that drives that access and permissions. So that's one thing that we get a lot of questions about that looking back, I think I left out of the presentation. And then just sort of in general about the effort last year, Shannon and I presented on all of our lessons learned, where we came from. We spent 4 years doing data development for the Air Force. And then we've been in data maintenance for roughly 2 years now. And so now we've really entered into this data maintenance GIS support phase. And the GeoPortal allows for some really neat opportunities for these support requests and building these applications, making the data available in more interactive and different ways. And so we've really been trying to leverage that and make the most out of what's available to us to help the Air Force meet its mission requirements. So it's been really neat to see the progression. I think that AFGIMS and GIS are planning to upgrade and expand some of the capabilities for that platform, which we're really excited about, being able to then capitalize on those updates and improvements that should be coming in roughly the next year or so. So yeah, we have tons of ideas. I get really excited about all of the options and opportunities that are available. And so this whole AFGIMS GeoPortal setup has just opened a lot more doors, and so we're happy to talk about any ideas. I have tons of them. I just want to make all sorts of applications and maps. Just want to encourage anyone that's on the session to feel free to reach out. We're really passionate about what we do, and so we'd love to take some time and talk to anyone that's interested.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's see. Check the chat box one more time. I don't see any new questions. So we'll work backwards up the line to Ben. Are you still there? Ben Silvernell? We may have lost Ben, or maybe he hasn't unmuted his mic.
Oh, sorry. Yep,
Ben.
I was double muted there, so we're good now.
No problem. We have you back.
So I think
go ahead.
Maybe after the presentation, that may have begged the question of kind of where do we go from this starting point, which, to kind of remind people, we're just developing a framework and working on getting stakeholder buy-in from our asset management, our real estate programs, our GIS and survey cops, and then of course the natural resource management program and the stewardship business line managers. But when we get through that very important step of making sure that we're asking and studying the right questions and seeking to compile data to support this analysis, I think where we want to go is, use what's available. I mean, we've got a lot of great technology that we want to, leverage using to really support field data collection tools that get into supporting staff at the district and projects. And so that way we're getting consistent spatial data to roll up into this analysis. We're working on our data standards. That's been kind of an ever evolving process, and we're trying to get ahead of this now, anticipating that we'll want folks to use these tools as they come out to make sure that we have a schema that works, that answers the same questions that we want to, that can help support answering the same questions that come up for an effort involved with asset management. So that's we're kind of looking a couple steps ahead to make sure that we don't get tripped up when we get to the next level here. And then the core now has a common operating picture that uses maps and dashboards, as I'm sure most people are using nowadays. And we're really excited to bring in data visualization at different administrative levels, but to allow that at the to be a part of our UCOP. I think we want to get involved with that there once we know that we're able to support it with quality data and quality assessments.
Okay, thank you. I'll ask you the same as I asked Gwen. were there any questions that you anticipated being asked that you feel like you need to bring forward and just talk a little more about?
Yeah, I'm looking through my notes on this here, and I know it was a pretty high-level presentation. I think, you know, when it comes to the invasive species, there may be some questions folks have about, you know, where does that data come from currently, and where are we, you know, seeking to improve that. So we do have you know, national, like kind of the bare minimum standard that we use to gather data from across all projects. Nationally is there's a data call system that we have, and we actually get project level data entry. We've made some improvements on that method from in the past. We've gotten to standardized regional lists that were developed with consultation with the business line managers and staff that specialize in invasive species in the region, and consulted with the Corps' invasive species leadership team, which is a national team that draws members from different districts and has expertise in that. So it was a combined effort to create these kind of regional lists and then ensure that we're using the, you know, proper species identifiers and species names, just to avoid any errors in that data that's collected in the most simple form on an annual basis. But we do also encourage folks to, you know, look at EdMaps or to use EdMaps if they have the capability and it works for them. And so we've pulled data from that to work on this analysis as well. And we are, I was speaking of data standardization with our spatial data standard. We've been spending the last year refining the Corps' nuisance species data model so that it actually better aligns with the spatial data that you would get in EdMaps. And so that can, you know, hopefully facilitate being able to appropriately pull data from that would be collected from two different sources, depending on what works best for the field to either provide that data or to map it themselves.
Okay, thank you. So we're out here in the audience. Anyone have any GIS or natural resources questions you want to poll to our presenters? I'm just capturing what Michael just threw into the chat box. Okay, I see no hands raised or any new entries into chat.
It's at the end of the day, people are worn out.
Worn out. So we'll move on to Dylan one more time. Dylan, on your two presentations, can you hear us? Can you unmute your mic, please? Hello?
Paul, you might have to hit *6 if you're on the phone. Tim, you might be able to unmute him too.
Okay, I'm looking for him. Dylan, if you can hear me, can you unmute? I'm not able to unmute him, Michael.
Or not even through Zoom?
That's what I'm trying, not through Zoom.
Okay.
Lorraine Shaughnessy just chimed in, said generally you cannot unmute someone in Zoom.
Yeah, you can ask them to unmute themselves.
That was the only option I had. Dylan Brown, are you there? Can you hear us? And if you can you unmute, please? Going once. Going twice. Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and do a quick closeout and just go ahead and move toward ending this session. I want to thank our presenters for the 4 presentations we had to look at today and prior to our conference. The Century of Land Use Change at Wake Atoll, a Century of Wake Fish Surveys, Managing for External Impacts to Environmental Stewardship of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works, Water Resource Development Projects, and from CIML, the Transforming Air Force Engagement Through Cloud GIS Solutions. I want to thank our presenters for being with us today, and want to thank all of our guests for coming in and listening into this live session. I appreciate you all. Look forward to seeing you virtually later this week, and wish you all a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody who helped out with this session.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. I'll stay on if anyone wants to talk. Sometimes there's folks that are shy that want to wait until right at the end if they have a question or specifically want to talk one-on-one with somebody.
I think the session got upwards of 160 participants, Tim.
Wow, 160? Is that what you said?
People dropped in and out throughout. It hovered more around 120, but at one point we had 160.
Okay, great.
Do we have our CIML people still on the line? If so, we have a question for you.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Hey, Gwen, how much trend analysis is requested from installations to CIML?
We haven't seen as much trend analysis coming out of the installations. We've seen more of that on the AFCEC enterprise level for the whole Air Force. But there has been some, but one area that we're looking at doing more trend analysis is with the PFAS, PFOA data and restoration data, and looking at things like tying precipitation and groundwater levels into contaminant concentrations and seeing if there's a seasonality impact or anything like that. We have seen some trend analysis with the natural resources I know you can do a lot of Tinker Air Force Base does a lot of tracking of their Texas horned lizards. So since they have a really good data set, that's something that is really available to them. So that's kind of why we spent 4 years on the data development side of things, was getting a data set built. I know it was hard for everybody to be patient for that to finish, but now that we have those data sets, it's enabling us to be able to perform more meaningful analysis. And then we've partnered with BASH at the half level and have started working with them on some trend analysis for their data as well, and building applications with data for natural resources data sets that impact BASH, and looking at a lot of analysis that we can do for them. So it's out there, but like I said, it seems to be more at the enterprise level, but we're happy to do any that the bases request. Definitely available for that.
Yeah, y'all are assisting with some work, at installation level out on the East Coast. More specifically with climate change related coastal resilience kind of stuff.
Yes, yeah, we have an application with some of those data results, and then we're also hosting the PDFs with the report summaries and the appendices on the Geo portal. So that's something that I think there's a lot of untapped potential with leveraging that data as our other team members on the climate change team at CIML expand that analysis across more bases.
And Michael, I see you plugged a reminder for everyone to join us at the NMFWA Trivia event, which will start about 5:15 this afternoon. So those of you who are still on the line, please join us for the social hour, NMFWA social hour. That room will open up in about 20-25 minutes. For those of you that are still on the line, do you have any questions? It was our pleasure, Paul. Thank you for offering your thanks to us for the session and presenters. Paul Jorina sends his thanks to our presenters for putting together this session. Thank you very much. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left on this session, GIS session. It's still open, so anyone's still on the line, if they want final stab at any questions for our presenters, feel free to chime in now. We'll be closing this session in just a few minutes. Carla Meyer says, thank you, excellent presentations. Okay, one last time, I want to thank Gwen and Shannon and Benjamin and Dylan for your presentations today. I certainly appreciate all the information that you brought for us and shared with us today. I thought this was a very productive GIS technical session. I mean, all of your expertise, as always, because GIS is something I've always been fascinated with, but for those of you that do the work, crunching data day in and day out on GIS is just amazing what you can produce. Always been a fan, fascinated with maps, and I know that's something that's near and dear to your heart as well as mapping. But I do appreciate everything you presented to us today, and look forward to seeing you hopefully next year. We'll be in Spokane next year, and I hope all of us can be together for next year's event, and looking forward to seeing you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Gwen.
Yes, thanks everyone.